Good morning to everybody. Thank you for coming. I have heard that you spent a hot and intensive night party yesterday. So thank you for coming. And now we have the first plenary speaker, Professor Frank Feder, who is senior academic researcher and group leader of Göttingen Academy of Sciences and Humanities. From 1994 to 1999, he has been academic researcher of an important project about the Coptic version of the text of the Septuaginta. From 21 to 22, he was academic researcher as well and leader of the project of the Ägyptisches Wörterbuch, a dictionary of the ancient Egyptian, in Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities. And from 2013, 2014, he was leading another project about Strukturen und Transformationen der Wortsätze der ägyptischen Sprache, structures and transformation of the Egyptian lexicon. Also a project in Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities. And since 2015, nowadays, he's senior academic researcher of the Digitale Gesamtedition Übersetzung des Koptisch-Saidischen Alten Testamentes, a complete digital edition and translation of the Coptic Saitic Old Testament. So Professor Frank Feder is not only a nice guy, a splendid professor, a great researcher. He's a great man as well. So you are going to enjoy a wonderful plenary session now, and then we will have, not as yesterday, about 15, 20, perhaps more minutes to talk to him for the discussion. So please, Frank, what you want.
Yeah, thank you, Juan Pedro, for this flattering introduction. So this puts me under pressure to show that I'm a great man. Good morning, everyone who came here so early to hear this talk. I want to take you to a journey into early Christianity. We start in the 4th century, and this is the time when in many, especially Eastern churches, challenges appeared about the Bible and the biblical canon. And I will talk about, if I say Eastern churches, about the Egyptian Coptic church, the Syriac church, and the Ethiopic church, which are in different ways interconnected over history until today. But we won't talk about today. We won't talk about so much after the Middle Ages. So we start in late antiquity and go up to the medieval era. And we will see that there are some crucial events that trigger to a certain extent the development of the churches and their interconnectedness. So everything starts with a statement that became very influential by the equally influential Archbishop of Alexandria, Athanasius, who was Archbishop from 328 to 373, and he was the first to send around these festal letters for Easter, which became programmatic for the church. And he, of course, influenced not only from Egypt, from Alexandria, not only Egypt, but also Syria. And there was this struggle about the sovereignty in the church between Antiochia, Alexandria, and Constantinople, of course, and also Rome in the background. So we will see what happens. So in this festal letter of 367, he felt the necessity to describe what is the canon of the Bible. And I speak here especially about the Old Testament. This is my specialty. So feel that the New Testament is, of course, included. And he talked about the New Testament too. But the complex thing was the Old Testament because of the comparison to the Hebrew Bible. And I quote from Athanasius' festal letter, because I have been urged by genuine brothers and sisters and instructed from the beginning to set forth in order the books that are canonized, transmitted and believed to be divine, so that those who have been deceived might condemn the persons who led them astray, and those who have remained pure might rejoice to be reminded of these things. He spoke and wrote about 22 books that is conform to the letters of the Hebrew Bible. It was an important thing at that time. And therefore, some books were just put together to form one. So the list about the Old Testament he gave in his letter included, of course, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. The Kingdom books 1 and 2 were counted as one book, as well as 3 and 4 kingdoms. So that is 1 and 2 Kings is 1 and 2 Samuel in the Hebrew Bible, and of course 1 and 2 Kings in the Hebrew Bible too. Chronicles 1 and 2 was counted as one book, 1 and 2 Esdras 2, the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Job, the 12 minor prophets is one book. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Baruch, Lamentations, letter of Jeremiah, of course, one book. Ezekiel and Daniel. He further wrote, but for sake of greater accuracy, I add this, writing from necessity. There are other books, in addition to the preceding, which have not been canonized, but have been appointed to be by the ancestors to be read. In Greek, it's these famous Anaginos Komena, so appointed to be read. To those who newly join us and want to be instructed in the word of piety. And these books were the Wisdom of Solomon, Syriac, or Ben Sira, Esther, Judith, and Tobit. He didn't mention additions to Daniel, additions to Ether, the Maccabee books, and the Prayer of Manasseh. So the necessity he was forced by, it becomes obvious, is only to illustrate, you don't have to read all this. It's a sample of the different lists given by different authors, and especially also by these famous Pandect Bibles, Greek Pandect Bibles, the Alexandrinos Codex, Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus, which in my view came all from Egypt. There are different opinions, of course, but it's not our topic today. So you see at the first glance that there are very different numbers of biblical books which appear here. And so Athanasius already, from what is circulated in his time, of course, felt this necessity to limit the canon of biblical books of the Old Testament. The Coptic Canon, if we can speak of this, began, of course, very early. So the translation of the Old and the New Testament into Egyptian, or otherwise known as Coptic, began in the 4th century at least. And we find a very diverse picture in this century, different dialectal versions. So we have about 4 or 5 literary dialects, but there was one authorized translation. We don't know yet exactly who was behind this, but certainly the monastic cycles. Egypt has been a country from the 3rd century before Christ, strongly bilingual, at least in the upper classes. So the Bible, the word of the Bible came to Egypt, of course, in Greek. But for the people in the countryside, the very strong and influential monastic movement from Egypt felt the necessity to translate it. And this became the Sahidic dialect became the standard translation, and it's the most widespread and most complete record of the translation of the Bible into Egyptian. So we see already that we have the same number of books Athanasius mentioned, but there's no mentioning of wisdom, Sira, and so on as Anaginos Komena. So nobody said or wrote that these books are not canonized. So, and this is also the practice, as we can see in the Egyptian church and the manuscripts. There have never been any mentioning of that a part of these books is canonized and the others, or some of them, are not canonized but appointed to be read. So this difference is not existent in the Egyptian church. And moreover, we have fragments of Maccabees and the prayer of Manasseh in Egyptian, but these are from extra biblical context. So we can be sure that these were left out in this Syriac standard translation. Also, the translation itself is a bit more free and open to revision and other things, while the Syriac standard translation is quite uniform and the text remains very stable until the medieval era. And that there was more about the problems, what is the biblical canon, Athanasius phrases in the same letter later. I quote, "Nevertheless, beloved, the former books are canonized, the latter only read, and there is no mention of the apocryphal books. Rather, the category of apocrypha is an invention of heretics who write these books whenever they want and then generously add time to them, so that publishing them as if they were ancient, they might have a pretext for deceiving the simple folk. Who has made the simple folk believe that those books belong to Enoch, even though no scripture existed before Moses? On what basis will they say that there's a secret book of Isaiah? He preaches openly on a high mountain and says, I did not speak in secret or in a dark land. He quotes from the book of Isaiah here. How could Moses have an apocryphal book? He is the one who published Deuteronomy with heaven and earth as witnesses. And he quotes from Deuteronomy itself. So that shows us that a lot of other books circulated also from the New Testament. And Athanasius coined this word, but we know still today apocryphon for these writings, which are even not appointed to be read. It's just an invention of heretics. Yeah, now we come to the Syriac church and the Syriac Canon. We have to discern three different ecclesiastical traditions in the Syriac tradition. The East Syriac, or formerly called Nestorian Church, condemned by several councils, and the Nestorians fled even to China and had an afterlife for many centuries there in Persia, China, and so on, and of course in Mesopotamia. The West Syriac, also known as Syriac Orthodox or Miaphysite, earlier and less appropriate, also Monophysite and Jacobite Church. And the Chalcedonian, originally part of the West Syriac tradition, consisting of the Melkite and the Maronite churches after the Council of Chalcedon, 451. We'll come back to this. The translation of the Bible into Syriac has also different traditions. The first one is the so-called Peshitta. It's the common Bible of all Syriac Christians from all three traditions, translated from Hebrew from the 2nd century onwards. So it's one of the earliest translations. The so-called Syro-Hexapla, a Syriac translation of the Septuagint, column of Origen's Hexapla, translated by Bishop Paul of Tella in Egypt, in the monastery of Anaton between 615 and 617, together with the New Testament translated by Thomas of Harkel. That was the time when the Patriarch of Antioch had to flee from the Persian Sassanid invaders who arrived in Antioch in 613. So the Syriac church had fled to Egypt. And this is very important for the historical context. This very literal translation directly from Origen's Septuagint column of his hexapla was made in Egypt. So with the help of the Egyptian brothers. So while we don't know exactly the manuscripts from which the Egyptian Syriac standard translation was made, they must have had these Greek manuscripts still when the Syriac brothers came to Egypt to translate from Origen. This is a story that has to be researched. We don't know yet, but we know this historical context at least. And there are several translations, maybe, for example, Jacob of Edessa, he died in 708, of course, many others, that these books, the Peshitta and the Syro-Hexapla, were translated again or revised on the basis of these existing translations. To describe the Surya Canon, I quote the famous scholar Lucas van Rompuy: "No final and authoritative list of accepted books was ever established." It goes even further than with the Coptic Canon. The Copts, of course, somehow stayed with Athanasius, who was a very prominent figure, and still is a saint of the Coptic Church, of course, like in many other Orthodox churches. But in Syria, there was nothing like a closed canon. So most important witness of the Syro-Hexapla is a manuscript in Milan, in La Biblioteca Ambrosiana from the late 8th and early 9th century. And here we see already some of the books which are, according to Athanasius, Anaginos Comana, like the Wisdom of Solomon. And here explicitly the letter of Jeremiah and the additions to Daniel appear. And Baal and the Dragon was not very famous in Athanasian thinking. So again, the historical context, what brings the churches together with the Ethiopian church, of course, is a bit different. We come to this in a minute. The Coptic and the West Syriac Orthodox churches, under the pressure after the Chalcedonian Council that created this discussion or this dispute, this schism between the Greek Orthodox and some of the Eastern Orthodox churches, in 451 brought the Syriac Orthodox Church and the Coptic Orthodox Church closely together. And one of the famous figures of the Syriac Orthodox, Severus the Great, he lived in Egypt and reorganized the Egyptian church. So they were so close as brothers and sisters that the history is not correctly to be understood without this close connection. And of course, they had to share the Sassanide occupation. So in Syria, we heard about already in 613, the Sassanides came to Egypt in 619, and it lasted until 629, the occupation there. That, on the other hand, gave the opportunity to the Syriac and Egyptian church to reorganize as an Miaphysite Orthodox denomination against, of course, competition and direct confrontation with the Greek Orthodox or Byzantine Church of Constantinople. And of course, then Syria and Egypt were separated from the Byzantine or East Roman Empire by the Arabic conquest that started in Syria in 631, and Egypt was then in the end definitely occupied and by the Arabs in 642. The Deuterocanonical books, this is a description what is rather the result of the conflict between the Catholic and the Protestant church in Europe, and has nothing to do with what was the reality in the Eastern churches in the Near East. According to the Peshitta tradition, there we see that we have many books which were not even mentioned by Athanasius, like the Maccabees, or the third book of Ezra, and the Odes even. They appear in the Bibles as an addition to the Psalms in the Coptic and Syriac tradition. or the letter of Baruch. This would be something Athanasius certainly had put under Apocrypha. These appear in the oldest Pandect, Syriac Pandect Bibles as a normal part of the Syriac biblical canon. It fits. So, and the pseudo-hexapla translation also shows us a very diverse canonicity. There we have again another Milan Bible, Paris Bible, and another in Florence. Completely different numbers of books that are part, and of course, a Pandect Bible is a one-volume book, and it creates by itself a kind of canonicity. And if this is already diverse in 4 different Pandect Bibles, you can imagine that this the limitation of biblical books was not the very matter of the Syriac Church. And then here again, we have the Maccabees and even the 6th book of Josephus' Jewish War that was counted as a biblical book, but never has been the case, for example, in the Coptic Church. Yeah, the Ethiopian Christianity and the Ethiopian Canon is related to the Egyptian and Syriac Church by the legendary mission from Egypt. So the Ethiopian head of the church has been appointed in Egypt until after the Second World War. So that is, but the early history of the Ethiopian church is of course still a mystery to us because we have so few records. But I can quote again, and this is even a larger picture than we saw from the quotation of Luc van Rompuy, one of the famous Ethiopian scholars, Steve Delmater, wrote in what I edited with in the Textual History of the Bible, Volume 2. The Bible of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is unique. With 81 books, it is the largest Christian canon in use today. And it includes works rarely encountered outside of Ethiopian Christianity. 1 Enoch, we remember that Athanasius especially mentioned there is no book of Enoch, this is Apocryphon. For example, exists in complete form only in Ge'ez, classical Ethiopic. Bible and canon are inappropriate terms for much, if not all, Christian history in Ethiopia. So that makes clear where we are here. So the first account on the arrival of Christianity is by Rufinus of Aquileia, so 4th, 5th century, about Frumentius, his shipwreck and stay in Aksum, and his later mission to Ethiopia inspired by Emperor Constantine. So there's some record, but the whole story is of course a legend. King Ezana took on Christianity in the 4th century, and substantial national conversion to Christianity must have taken place in the middle of the 4th century. So far we know, but very few records about that. Aksumite inscription make a first translation initiative from Greek into Ge'ez in the late 4th, early 5th century probable. This is the legendary translators are Frumentius himself. He might have brought books from Alexandria. We remember Athanasius was the archbishop at that time, and there's also some information that he gave several biblical books in Greek, of course, to Frumentius when he went back to Ethiopia. Then there are the legendary 9 Psalms in the 5th, 6th century. This is more or less legendary, and the Metropolitan Salama in the 14th century. He is called also the translator, who translated many works from Arabic into Ge'ez. The oldest, this is important, the oldest extant manuscripts of the Ethiopic Bible, which can be dated with any certainty and come from the mid-14th century, while we start in Syria with the Peshitta in the 2nd and in Egypt in the 4th century. We have safely dated manuscript record only from the 14th century. That's typical for Ethiopia. some messages, in fact, only a handful may come from the 12th century, but this is far from safe. Today's known Ethiopian manuscripts count thousands. With help of microfilm and digital archives, scholars can easily assemble at least 30 manuscripts of every book of the Ethiopic Bible. Half of the manuscripts being not earlier than the 16th century and younger. That's the best biblical record we have in manuscripts, but it's very late, of course. Yeah, some of the lists that influenced coming from Arabic sources, the Ethiopic, I can't say canon, the Ethiopic Bible tradition. So they have this number of 81 books that became somehow canonical, but not canonical in the way Athanasius would see this, or the Protestant church in Europe. That is always an option. 81 is okay, but there are others and they are used in the church, in the liturgy, so it might be less, it might be more. There is no real limit of the number of books in the Ethiopic church. Yeah, in Egypt, we encounter beginning, so in the manuscript record, beginning with the 9th, 10th century, a new standard Bible, the so-called Bohairic Bible. The interesting thing is that not all books, even mentioned by Athanasius, are part of this Bible. So we have no historical books. These are Joshua, Judges, 1, 4 Kingdoms, and 1, 2 Chronicles, are only extant as quotations in liturgical manuscripts. So it's not the whole book. So we have no Bohairic translation of many other books. And so we have the Pentateuch, the Psalms, Proverbs, ending with chapter 14, verse 26, and Job together, the prophets, and Wisdom and Syriac only in liturgical quotations. Here, at least you have some nice examples of manuscripts. So on your left-hand side is one of the most beautiful manuscripts in the Vatican Library, maybe one of the oldest Bohairic Bible manuscripts from the 9th, 10th century, the Bohairic, and you see the added Arabic column that has been added in the 13th century. And one of the problems of research is that we discovered that the Arabic text is not the translation of the Bohairic. It's some other Arabic Pentateuch, but not the translation of the Bohairic text. So this transmission, we will see in a minute what is about. And on the other hand, a fragment of the book of Daniel, I showed only for the wonderful illumination in the manuscript. So what brings to a certain extent the three Eastern churches together is again the historical framework. So we have from the 11th to the 13th century new translations and orientations in all three churches. We have the initiative of the translation of the Coptic Christian heritage into Arabic from the 11th to the 13th century. The so-called Syriac Renaissance, a period in Syriac literature of great productivity, at the same time characterized by growing acceptance of Arabic science and Arabic and Muslim cultural and religious patterns. And for Ethiopia, I only quote one of the greatest scholars of our time, Samuel Rubinson. Moreover, this transmission, the transmission of the Egyptian heritage into Arabic, was not only responsible for how the Coptic Church came to know and keep their patristic heritage, but it also governed the transmission of patristic literature to Ethiopia, since most translation of patristic texts into Ethiopic are based on Christian Arabic translations coming from the Coptic tradition. So around the 12th century, interest in other religious texts spawned a new age of translations that lasted over 2 centuries in Ethiopia. So we here have the situation that in Syria and Egypt, of course, the common language also of the Christians had become Arabic. And also now the consequence was the liturgy was still in Coptic Bohairic and in Syriac, of course, but it's Aramaic. But Arabic was omnipresent everywhere. And the consequence was that everything got translated. And these translations into Arabic became influential in Ethiopia, because they translated again the biblical books into Ethiopian from Arabic manuscript. That makes the whole picture so complex. One of the typical Bibles of this age is, for example, here in Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale de France, another Pentateuch with Bohairic and Arabic, as it is designed from the beginning as a two-column Bohairic and Arabic manuscript. So as an example how things can develop, we have in mind Athanasius' Apocrypha, condemnation and all that. Now we have some texts that to some extent very strange, and their origin is disputed, because we surmise that they had a Greek Vorlage, but we have no Greek manuscript of this. This is on the one hand, these are, we can call them Jeremianic pseudepigrapha, the Jeremiah's prophecy to Pashur, exclusively transmitted in the Coptic, Arabic, Ethiopic literary continuum. Here we see again how they interchanged such texts. It's preserved in Sahidic and Bohairic in the Holy Week lectionaries, but the manuscripts are later than the 13th century. So this is very different from the early Coptic tradition. We don't know any Greek text that transmitted these, so we only have it in Coptic, Arabic, and Ethiopic. And they became, this prophecy became part of the Arabic Bible in the book of Jeremiah. All the other example is the history of the captivity in Babylon, certainly a Greek follower, but we don't have. Survived only in Coptic and two dialects, Sahidic and Fayumic, and Arabic. Also in so-called Gashuni manuscripts, so Syriac writing in Arabic language. The oldest Coptic manuscript dated to the 9th century comes from the Archangel Michael monastery in the Fayum oasis, and the oldest Arabic manuscript is dated to 1474. There are parallels with the so-called Paralipomena, Jeremiah, and the fourth book of Baruch. They had a wide dissemination in Egypt and from there to Syria and Lebanon. We still see that all that what Athanasius wanted to impose to some extent didn't work. So these things, these books, even if they were excluded from the classical Syriac, so Surah Hexapla Peshitta, and the Coptic Syriac standard translation, via the Arabic made its way into the Bibles and then became, it's a Western term, canonical. The so-called, this new initiative in Syria created these so-called West Syriac or Masoretic manuscripts, which have again a wide range of biblical books, where we find all these Anagonis Comina and every other books that would be apocryphal in the eyes of Athanasius. And to close this session, our journey, some of you might know this manuscript that shows physically the relationship between the Egyptian, Coptic, Syriac, and Ethiopian tradition. This is the famous Pentaglot manuscript in the Vatican Library, the Codex Barberini Dur, and it has the Ethiopic column of Ethiopic, Syriac, Bohairic, Coptic, Arabic, and Armenian. And here's another column. See what it is. I think it's again Syriac. And when this manuscript was discovered, because of these 6 columns, they tried to sell it as an exemplar of Origen's hexapla. But of course, it was not this, because this is a wonderful example. This is from Egypt, from one of the monasteries in the Wadi Natun, and shows the physical presence of Ethiopian, Syriac, Egyptian, and Armenian monks in Egypt that certainly worked together to create a psalm manuscript. The Psalter is omnipresent in the liturgy in the Eastern churches, how they lived and prayed together with such wonderful manuscripts. Thank you so much. I hope it was.
So thank you very much, Frank, for this luminous presentation. Very complex matter.
Oh, yes.
In a complex context, in the Egyptian soil, where the connection between non-canonical text and canonicity is very, very hard task, and that still remains to be done. So we are only at the beginning of the research in this field of study. So we have so many minutes, I think, about 15, 20 minutes more or less for discussion. So please, when you want.
First of all, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. You spoke about the evolution of the evolving, not canon, but groups of books that were in different traditions. I wondered whether there were choices made which reflected either the reality or the preferences of church fathers in different places. Was it, I imagine, wasn't haphazard. So, what was there a reason why certain things were chosen in or not chosen in two collections? And I'd be interested in knowing what the reason might be.
Yeah, of course, a very good question. You're absolutely right. There have been commentaries, especially from Syriac fathers, who wanted to delimit the canon of biblical books, and these were quoted and repeated, but with no result. So there was always this necessity felt by the fathers of the church that we should have a rather limited canon, or we should at least discern, like Athanasius did, in canonical, which are for the liturgy, and others that can be read. But this never became so influential that some books would have disappeared. So they came always back to the tradition. So it's also a very complex thing, but in different times and places, statements that became influential, great translators and revisers of the Bible said we should make a cut here, but then these books they even didn't mention or even condemned reappeared in manuscripts.
But like some were chosen into like the Coptic, and some were chosen into the Syrian. I mean, was there a preference, a theological preference, a societal need that showed that different books remained in and certain books did remain in? That was my question.
Yeah, that's it's very difficult to say. I might only take the example of the Maccabee books for Coptic. That's my special interest. So we have some manuscripts of the Maccabee books, and especially the chapters of the martyrs, the Maccabee martyrs, because the Egyptian church itself was somehow based on the call of martyrs. So from the beginning, so the Synaxarion is the most important book for the Coptic liturgy until today, for this part of the liturgy. And so we know that the Maccabees, especially the chapters for the martyrs, were used in liturgy, but they never became part of a biblical manuscript. So we have manuscripts, certainly liturgical, and it was used for the liturgy to commemorate the martyrs. But this is exactly the flexible handling of these things. So the manuscripts don't show them, but we know exactly that they were read and used in the liturgy. Yeah. I hope this explains. Yeah.
More questions, please.
Did the presence of these different canons lead to have implications in terms of relations between different churches? In other words, do we have evidence of them, sort of making comments about how, the canon of another church is wrong, or again, any implications in terms of inter-Christian relations?
So rather not between the Syriac and the Egyptian church, and by far not the Ethiopians. They were receptive to everything. It came to that with the attempts from the Protestant and the Catholic Church, in beginning from the 17th century onwards, 18th century, when Bibles became available in print, also Arabic Bibles. Then the question of canon became again relevant under the influence of the Western discussions. And of course, the conflict between the Protestant and the Catholic Church was also about the biblical canon. So Luther insisted in that generally the Bible can only be, or for the Old Testament, of course, can only be the books of the Hebrew Bible. How can other books be part of the Bible of the Old Testament? And this was imposed into Egypt. But the Catholic and Protestant mission, with all their book printing and everything, didn't touch the core of the Eastern churches. They stayed with their traditions. Yet we know also that the Portuguese came to Ethiopia in the 16th and 17th century and tried to missionate Ethiopia. But in the end, they said, we have 81 books. This is our tradition. You can print us Bibles, teach us Latin, but in the end, that was forgotten, and the Portuguese went away, and the Ethiopian church is, like, in their view, there has always been. Right? Yeah, but it's very, very complex. But that was the main stream of influence to a canonicity came from Europe, in fact.
More questions, please? Yes.
Can we get the presentation, because it is not on the webpage?
Yeah, of course.
First,
I think
question,
Tatiana can manage that.
Thank you very much for the historical development. We know it for the Faculty of Theology, but thank you for the actualization. Nevertheless, we are talking about today. So when we follow the US TV preachers, the fundamentalists, the people having the Bible in the pocket, reading it like a newspaper, this is the word of God. So do you think that the faculties are preparing the theologians, the pastors, for not to forget what a difficult process it was, canonization, and we cannot use the Bible like the book printed in any publishing house. So the influence is revelation, but there is interpretation, there is inspiration, illumination, text, context, meaning. So the shortcomings of using the Bible today. So do you think the pastor have no time to study it, are not patient, are not educated? So what is the practical application? Because there are two words, the academic analysis of the canonization, but after that I open the computer and in another word. What is your feelings when you follow the development?
That's a good question. I see myself rather as a scholar here. And I can simply answer, that was the reason why Luther translated the Bible into German, that everyone can read what is written in the Bible. And we have the same with the Quran. There are people running around. I don't want to blame the Quran. It's poetry, it's wonderful. But people, we talk about people running around with the Quran who even can't read it properly. And they pretend to know the word of God. That's the problem. It's rather the ambition of people. So if you look into what is written, you should know Arabic well, or Hebrew, or Greek. And people who use translations should rather be reluctant to speak about knowing the word of the Bible. So they should rather concentrate that I use a translation into English, King James Bible, something. And the King James Bible has a history of its own. And that this is the ultimate word is simply not true.
cannot
Yeah.
tell it. I will,
Of course, I do.
Going back to the text, first of all, thank you for this presentation, which was very enlightening, and I really don't know much about this. But when I was looking at that first list that you showed from Athanasius, it seemed like the only text of the ones that he said was apocryphal, right? Did not belong in the canon. That is in the Hebrew Bible canon was Esther. Right, which he
Yeah.
says it. So was there something about Esther that, that made this one not belong with the others? Because I was trying to see when you put up the list, they were a little small.
Yeah.
But so was there something about Esther that made them not want to do that?
Yeah, very good question. There were discussions that Esther is written by someone who describes historical events in the Greek church, or let's say the Eastern Church of the Eastern Empire. And therefore, they didn't want it to be a canonical book, especially Athanasius, because of these discussions. But he didn't exclude it. He only said it's appointed to be read. And this reappeared because there were also additions to Esther. In the biblical tradition, you have a version with a shorter text and then additions that appears in the Septuagint manuscripts already. And therefore, with these additions, that is problematic, even if it was a part of the Hebrew Bible, of course.
I wonder when we look at how the biblical tradition developed, we're very, very influenced by this idea that only the Hebrew Bible is the right one. Everything else has just somehow appeared due to historical circumstances and theologies. Especially when I've been listening to your talk today, you talk about it from a very different point of view, which I haven't really heard from when we listen to Catholic or Protestant dominated forums. Is it possible that even we, looking at these Egyptian and Syrian Ethiopian traditions, we're still influenced by this idea that only the Hebrew version is the true version? I don't know how to say that politely. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you are. The point is that there was a discussion already in antiquity that was taken up by also in Germany, for example, the famous scholar Paul de la Garde, who was in Göttingen. He was a brilliant scholar, but he also a crooked mind, because he took up the idea from antiquity that the Masoretic Bible, so the Hebrew Bible, the standard Hebrew Bible that was put together in the 1st century, is a falsification of the early Hebrew text. And only the Septuagint that was translated according to the legend in the 3rd century, so long before Christianity, by Hebrew scholars from Israel, from Judea, in Egypt, in Alexandria, for Ptolemy II, the Egyptian king of Greek origin, and that we have to go back to the Greek Septuagint to have the real text of the Hebrew Bible. So this whole conflict is old, but it was unfortunately taken by those anti-Semitic scholars like de la Garde to say that the Hebrews falsified the Bible, their own Bible. What's absurd. But he took this old discussion that was not as vicious as it became with the Nazis and all this anti-Semitic movement. But you see again how complex these things are. And there, of course, with the Nahal Hever found of Greek texts in the Hebrew in the Judean desert, and some other Hebrew texts there. For a long time, it was not known that the book of Ben Sira had a Hebrew version. That scholars for a long time believed that this has been written in Greek, but there was a Hebrew version of it. So if you look into the real manuscript record, then the things become diverse and complex. Yeah.
And then there's actually a lot of the early manuscripts are best preserved in Egypt,
Yeah,
in parallel everywhere else. Does this give an extra validity to the kind of Alexandria period, where the earliest, most complete versions, or at the same time, did people at that time, they're not really bothered about making one book, because how can anybody be reading this kind of manuscript? Is it actually more useful to have many small books?
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
manuscript? What this could have like a bit like humans.
Yeah, of course, the original tradition in Syria and Egypt was, Egypt never had these Pandect Bibles, so it was rather common to have one volume with one book or parts of one on the other book. So these are the examples we have. And it has been programmatic to have these Pandect Bibles. And even there, as you could see in the list, the three most influential Bibles from the 4th and early 5th century, so Vaticanus, the names because they are in these libraries. So I believe these are from Egypt. So the food Bibles, they have different content. The Alexandrinus has other books, partly than Sinaiticus from the Sinai monastery, or the Vaticanus, the famous Vatican manuscript. So you see already that there, that was certainly the idea, to put all the New Testament in one book, that this became programmatic. But even these three examples are not identical. So practice was diverse.
One more question. We still have 5 minutes.
You don't have to force it.
It's only an invitation.
So now with the Qumran documents, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they've been using a lot of modern technology, which has brought out more information. Has that impacted anything in your area with regard to the original texts and what seemed to be brought over and not?
I'm not a specialist for Hebrew, but I know from my colleagues that, of course, it changed the picture of what the Hebrew Bible was in the beginning, or how it developed. They are not that early, so it's not the 6th century BC, but they show us that in the Hebrew communities, also other texts circulated. Yeah? Of course, this changes the pictures, and they put manuscripts together and have always new things to discover.
Yeah, something.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I think there was a clear impact of the literature from Qumran through Greek and above all through Ethiopian, and perhaps through the Yemeni authors. Most of them converted from Judaism to Islam in early 7th century. So we have a lot of references in Arabic sources, but we have I think the greater example is the case of the one Enoch, the Ethiopian version of the book of Enoch, made in Ge'ez, and it's a very interesting manuscript, very interesting text, which is in fact a young text, but that reflects a very old readings. The small fragments discovered in Qumran, in Aramaic, of the book of Enoch confirm that the version preserved in Ge'ez is a text perhaps older than the Aramaic version preserved in Qumran. So in a way, I think that some people who emigrated from Qumran in the 1st century, perhaps one of them to Haran in Mesopotamia, and a part of them to North Arabian region, perhaps they took with them a lot of materials, manuscripts, that then they were disseminated in North Arabian area, and perhaps in the Ethiopian coast, just in front of Mecca. It's very important, but Well, we need more time to discuss that. So if you want, then in the break coffee, we can talk
So
about
we
it.
still don't know if the Ethiopian Enoch was translated from Greek or from Arabic.
Well, this is under doubt because, in some readings, it is clear that it is depending of a Greek text.
Yeah.
And we have some fragments
So
preserved.
we don't have the Greek.
But in other cases, this is not clear, and an Aramaic vorlage is preferred to the Greek vorlage. It is
Again,
complicated.
we don't know because we have only very late Ethiopian manuscripts. So
What is important, for instance, in a text of the 7th century, mid-7th century, like the Quran, we have literal quotations from one Enoch. It's very interesting to see that. So in early 7th century, the book of Enoch, perhaps not as a complete book in its 5 parts, was running in Central Arabia. Well, this is the end for our
thank you for the biblical study.